What I want to talk about today, I want to take us even further back in time. And we're going to look at the period right at the end of the last ice age and the period when we now know that people came into Scotland. I'm not going to say the first people came into Scotland because undoubtedly at some point we're going to find even earlier Paleolithic evidence. The Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, is a long, long period of time, and really it encompasses that period during which hominins are evolving into modern humans. What I want to talk about today, and really what I know a little bit about, I don't know, I'm not an evolutionary archaeologist or anything, but I want to talk about the very, very tail end of the Paleolithic, the period that we call the Late Upper Paleolithic. And that's the period when the last great ice age is disappearing, when the ice sheets are retreating, conditions getting warmer, and people start to spread out across Northwest Europe. It's a really exciting period because it's the time when Northwest Europe, as we know it today, when those roots are laid, when the landscape, the settlement kind of takes on the foundations of what will become the world that we all live in, that we know and love. One of the reasons it's so exciting is because when I was a student, it didn't exist. We were taught that during and immediately after the last great ice age, conditions in Scotland were just too harsh for human settlement. And so we were taught that although there may have been some Mesolithic settlement, perhaps in the south of Scotland, people weren't even sure whether there was any Mesolithic in the north, and a Paleolithic, just forget it. And really, although you might think that we know so much about archaeology, I think it's amazing that even just in the course of my professional career, that has changed, that has opened up totally. So what I want to talk to you today is really about exciting emerging evidence for the first settlers of Scotland after the ice. Now, again, I'm starting with a lot of kind of technical images. You can obviously, one of the advantages of recording the lecture is that you can go back to these and look at them in more detail. This particular image was drawn quite a while ago now, but it's still useful. It still gives us the basic information about when Britain has had ice ages, when it's been under cover of ice, when Britain has been joined to the continent, when it's been an island, general conditions about the environment and things. And you can see on the screen the big sort of white icebergs, ice sheets that we've drawn to try and give an idea of periods when Britain's been covered by ice. And the period that I'm wanting to talk about is really the period that's marked down as from about 15,000 up to the present day. It's the period just at the tail end of the last great ice age. And in fact, what you can see on that picture is that by about 15,000, the ice is getting less. We've drawn it diminishing. And there is a period when Scotland opens up, when the climate starts getting better. That's one of the things that I'm going to be going into a bit more detail about. But what you see is that then about 13,000 years ago, there's a very sudden change and everything closes down again. Conditions get much colder. It's a period that we call the Younger Dryas. And it's a period of cold environments when ice sheets reformed, glaciers in parts of Scotland. Life got much more difficult. It's one of the reasons that we've always thought people weren't around in Scotland. We now know we were wrong. And there are a few sites beginning to come forward for that period. So really, I want to be talking from this period, about 15,000 years up to the present day. Here's another horrendously technical diagram, but if you're interested in this and you're going to be reading some of the literature or whatever, this diagram will maybe help to put some of the technical terms into context. One of the problems in working in this period is that there's lots of different ways of describing the different periods of time, partly because research workers in Britain had their own names based upon where things occurred in the United Kingdom. People in the continent had the same sort of names, but obviously with continental sites. And then you also have the scientists looking at things like marine isotopes, which are a good indicator of cooler and warmer conditions. And so you will quite often hear phases referred to as marine isotope stage 1, marine isotope stage 2, that sort of thing. And so you can see in one of the columns here, you can see these marine isotope stages set out as well. You can also see the names of some of the principal archaeological industries. You can see the earlier Paleolithic industries like the Clactonian, Levallois, things like that, moving up into the Upper Paleolithic and the Mesolithic. The main problem with this image, and it's come from fantastic, massive project that was run a few years ago, the AHOB, Ancient Human Occupation of Britain project. The main problem is that although the name of the project references Britain, it didn't consider Scotland. And the reason for that is largely because it was assumed that we didn't have any evidence here. So I think the whole thing would be very different were it to be done today. But it's still a useful chart to look at. And here just a more simplified chart giving you some of the ideas of the terminology that we use with reference to Scotland. You can see some of the ice core or marine isotope events on the left. You can see European names like the Younger Dryas, the Boreal, Pre-Boreal, and so on. You can see the British terminology. Although everybody nowadays talks about the Younger Dryas, for a long time, people would call it the Loch Lomond Stadial, which is obviously a very Scottish name, and it got that name because there's evidence for glaciers in the mountains around Loch Lomond. Today, you tend to hear people will talk about the Younger Dryas, though older publications will obviously refer to the Loch Lomond Stadial. And that's a time when conditions get cooler again. There's a short and abrupt return to glacial conditions. Prior to that, you've got the Windermere interstadial, a period of warming. So some of these terms, it's quite useful just to get a hang on them. And obviously, very basic division between the Pleistocene, and we're just again right at the end of the Pleistocene, which is relates to Paleolithic occupation, quite often called also the Late Devensian in Britain. And then we move into the Holocene, which is today, which is the epoch that we now live in, depending on your views on the Anthropocene, but I guess that's a different lecture. Once you're into the Holocene, you're really into Mesolithic settlement. And we can look at that transition a bit more towards the end of the lecture. I think it's something we still need to do a lot of research on. Now, obviously, in this period, we're dealing about a Britain, a United Kingdom that looks very different to the sort of landscape that we know today. And one of the things to kind of take on board is that a lot of this information is related to modelling. So people will have data from specific sites, and then they're extrapolating between those sites to try and draw up images, ideas of how the world looked, how the wider area looked at that period. And of course, modelling is only as accurate as the amount of data that you put into it. And so I've put on the screen two very different images just to kind of try and bring this point home. So you've got the main coloured image, which shows the position of the ice sheets at the maximum of the last ice age. And you can see that they're running them right across Scandinavia, the Baltic, and so on, and right across to Britain, certainly covering Scotland. So that's one big ice sheet. But then you can see the image below, the black and white image, slightly more of a cartoony image, but no less informative for that. And it's looking at the picture towards the end, and they've broken that ice sheet. And it's still a moot point whether or not the ice sheet was continuous in the very late glacial. So you can see the information here where they're suggesting, in fact, not only that the ice sheet's not continuous, but that parts of the north of Aberdeenshire, Caithness and Orkney would have been ice-free. Quite a contentious point, but still one that some research seems to indicate. However, for my work and my kind of getting it into my head, what I'm doing is working from a project which runs out of the University of Sheffield, the Brit Ice project. This brings in lots of research from people all over the place, and it's looking at information about ice cover, the land, movement of the land and things. And the most recent Brit Ice images, models, certainly show that ice cover was continuous. It shows the British ice sheet running into the Scandinavian ice sheet. So perhaps this is the sort of thing that is the most up-to-date information that we have. And you can see on this particular image, the blue arrows give you an indication of where those ice sheets were moving. I think we all know from news reports from studies of Greenland and things, the ice sheets aren't static. They gradually move towards the sea. And for us, this has all sorts of implications because, for example, it shows us how lithic resources might have been moved around sort of prior to the landscape opening up. And this impacts on the lithic resources, on the types of stone that the first exploratory groups are going to find. So it's very important to get a hang on the directions in which we think different aspects of the ice are moving. And you can see that portrayed here on the screen. Now, from about 15,500 years ago, things start improving. The ice sheets retreat. Initially, obviously, they're just giving onto bare ground, but pretty quickly you get soils developing of sort of low heath type cover. We'd call it tundra today. I think it's very important to remember that even at the face of an ice sheet, and certainly out on the tundra, that doesn't mean that people couldn't be living there. It doesn't mean that there weren't people around. What it does mean, particularly when you've got groups who are exploring and exploiting areas that are largely covered by ice or covered by ice part of the year, means that the archaeological evidence is going to be very difficult to find, because obviously they're not necessarily even camping on the surface of the ground. And really the same with tundra. But things do open up and people can move in from quite early on. We know that people live in conjunction with ice today. There's really no reason why they wouldn't have done that 15,000 years ago when they're expert at living in these sort of landscapes. But anyway, here just a picture of the sort of low birch type woodland that very quickly follows the development of tundra as conditions get better. This is taken from Greenland today. Then, as I said, about 13,000 years ago, there's a really abrupt return. I mean, this must have come as a shock for any human groups that were living in and around or in the habit of visiting Scotland, possibly in as, you know, over a period of decades. Conditions suddenly get much colder and we move into what's known as the Younger Dryas. And you can see on the screen a fairly recent image just giving you an idea of where glaciers have been recorded during that period. So up in the Cairngorms, big complex across running really Loch Lomond, the West Highlands, possibly smaller complexes further north and out to the west on Skye and Rum and out on the Outer Isles. So a return to localised glacial conditions around Scotland, but of course that affects the rest of the country as well. Things change, people have to adapt. People are resilient. And all of this, as you've seen from some of the pictures, it's not just a question of ice cover and vegetation, it's also a question of land and sea levels. And again, I've mentioned it before, but Doggerland comes into play here. Britain is really just a part of Northwest Europe. People could explore right across by land, and we know people are highly mobile. Once again, two very different images, quite an old one now on the left, but just giving you an idea. Again, you can see they've gone for two separate ice sheets. In fact, I think a lot of images today would pull the ice sheets together. The second image, much less accurate one, obviously cobbled together using bits of Google Earth and things, but I rather like this image because it reminds us, and it's very important to remember, that this area between Britain and the continent, it's not just featureless plains, it's not just a land bridge, it is a whole landscape. It has topography, it has vegetation, rivers, lakes, coastline, and so on, and people and animals will be out there. So just quickly to look at how we get this, why Doggerland exists, and this is something that I can talk about in more detail in another lecture, but you're not just talking about changes in the amount of water in the ocean. That's obviously one big thing, that a lot of the water that's normally in the oceans around the world is taken up into the ice. And that causes an absolute drop in sea level. But it's not just that. It's also because of the action of an ice sheet on the land over which it sits. So really, you have to remember here that the land, although we kind of think of it as terra firma, it's actually not. It is flexible. And when you get the tremendous weight of an ice sheet on top of an area of land, that will depress the land down. And so you get the second black and white picture, the lower picture here, where the land that's immediately underneath the ice will sink. It's like if you sit on a lilo, for example, or push your hand into a balloon, you get a depression below the immediate weight, but either side it rises up and you get what's called a forebulge. And so that's why it's really important for people to know where the ice sheets were, because if you have an ice sheet right across from Britain to Scandinavia, that impacts on where the greatest pressure of ice is, and it impacts on how the land rises up either side, and that then affects how people will model the shape of Doggerland underneath. So you can see this particular image on the screen now of Doggerland. That's one which has been reproduced on a lot of sites, National Geographic and so on. And again, they're going for two separate ice sheets. So you get Doggerland rising up in between, partly because it's on the forebulge. And then as the ice melts, water increases and the land will slowly bounce back. And because of that, because this changing shape of the land is a mixture of the impact of the water in the ocean and the movement of the land, it's common actually to hear people talking about changes in relative sea level rather than changes in absolute sea level. Change in absolute sea level will just be related to the amount of water. A change in relative sea level will be related to the way in which the land moves as well. And so this image hopefully explains that in a bit more detail, and you can come back to it and look at it in more detail after the talk or whatever, if you're interested. And again, as I say, really put this up just to emphasize this point about Doggerland being a landscape. And now we've got the technology, we can actually start to reconstruct that landscape and what it looked like. We can look for places where there were lakes, where there were rivers. We can look at different vegetation and things out there. It's a complicated and slow process. But there are lots of techniques largely adapted from things like the oil industry, from subsea survey, coring below the seabed and things, where we can start to put together a picture. And really with this image that's on screen, you can see some areas where people have worked in more detail and the sorts of detail that they're starting to pull out about the landscape, which really today is just an area of seabed. And it's very important for us to be doing this work. And there's a big project, the Lost Frontiers project, running out of Bradford University. I'd encourage you to have a look at that. They've got a great Facebook page, which will lead you onto websites and things and give you the most recent information. But this is a big project that's looking at not just what Doggerland looked like, but also looking at things like the vegetation, animals, and trying to reconstruct the human population that's out there and how that landscape is changing. Because, of course, throughout this period, right at the end of the Ice Age and into the early Holocene, Doggerland is slowly disappearing. And so even though population densities are low and people are very mobile, that does have an impact on the way in which people live. So it's a really crucial project. And there are other people, obviously, other projects are available, but this is one of the main ones well worth having a look at. Now, we move on to the people. Well, of course, there's been an Upper Paleolithic, Late Upper Paleolithic. There's plenty of evidence from Northern Europe for people living at this time. And the main groups that you'll hear people talking about are the Hamburgian and the Ahrensbergian. Late Upper Paleolithic groups, again, highly transient, mobile hunter-gatherers. They're often talked about as if they focus on a singular type of animal in order to survive. This is slightly misleading. If you look at the animals, for example, the Hamburgian often talked about as reindeer hunters. It's kind of an easy shorthand, but it's largely come about because obviously reindeer, the bones of reindeer, the antlers survive pretty well. And so there are some spectacular sites where we can see where people were certainly preying on particular herds or whatever, and you get a lot of evidence of that. But of course, you have to remember that everyday life will have focused on hunting all sorts of animals, on gathering plants, on, everyday life is so much wider than that particular term reindeer hunter will bring in. And that's an important thing just to remember. Again, the Hamburgian slightly older than the Ahrensbergian perhaps living during the Younger Dryas when things are a little bit more difficult, life is a bit colder. And we largely identify these groups also from their stone tools, particularly the points that they're making, which just in common with cars or whatever today, do change with fashion. So we don't really know anything about, the clothes that they wore or whatever, but we can see what the kind of up-to-date Hamburgian hunter or Ahrensbergian hunter, we can see the sorts of points that they made and like to use. And that is one of the things that we use to look at the way in which life changes throughout this period. Some techie pictures of stone tools, but again, useful if you're looking at this in other publications and things. You'll see a lot of talk about something called a tanged point. Also shouldered points, all very similar. These are regarded as primarily hunting tools, possibly arrowheads, possibly spear points. You get them in different sizes, you get them in different shapes. You do see that groups very much follow fashions. Groups will make their tools in very similar ways. And so you get similar types of tools occurring in different places. And this just presents that, some of the different types of tools that people will find. And again, the way in which these tools can be grouped together into different groups. And a picture of a very classic tanged point you can see there, with the tang at the bottom, which would, we assume, be inserted into the haft, and then the sort of working end, the pointy bit, at the other end. And out on the North European plains, so we have these lots of sites now. Again, this is all fairly familiar, but you're kind of mobile hunter-gatherers. In this case, Hamburgian, principally often written about as focusing on reindeer herds, possibly following. Reindeer is a migratory animal, and there's quite a lot of evidence that these groups are following the reindeer. Reindeer are very important. They provide so much more than just food. They provide hide for clothing and shelters and things. They provide bones to be used as a raw material for tools. A lot going on with reindeer, but of course these people are needing other things as well. But generally the sort of picture that you get from the points and the sites are fairly short-lived settlements, perhaps quite a low population density, long ranging migration, sometimes pictures drawn up looking at, say, different types of stone that are moving around. And you can see that some of these groups are maybe migrating 300 or more kilometers. So highly mobile, coming out into the North Sea, coming out across Doggerland, but they're largely terrestrial hunters. There's evidence of them near the coast, but there's not so much evidence of them exploiting coastal resources. Perhaps we haven't found the sites, perhaps we haven't looked for them, but largely seemingly terrestrial hunters. And then we move into the Arensbergian life. Perhaps conditions have changed, perhaps a little bit more difficult, perhaps broadening out their territories, much more widespread. You get them right up into the south of Scandinavia. Still highly mobile. Some of the animals that have gone now, the larger animals like mammoth and things, less available, still using reindeer very much, still following the reindeer, but we also begin to see Arensbergian sites on the coast, and we begin to see them exploiting marine resources, going for some of the larger animals like seals and things, and probably also populations increasing, higher population densities, a bit more evidence of social hierarchy and things like that. And you can see here just an image showing you some of the sort of main area where we get these sites right across Northern Europe and coming into the south of the UK. Again, some of these maps, sort of slightly older now, might be expanded a little bit, but it gives you an idea of the kind of foundational archaeology that people are working from. And one of the interesting things is that right towards the end of this period, towards the end of the late glacial period, we start to see very specific sites occurring in sort of southern and western Sweden, and also northern Denmark and so on, called the Hensbacker. And these sites are very much using coastal areas. We see different types of stone tools beginning to come in, flake axes, broader kind of chisel axes and things. There's some suggestion that these tools might be related to woodworking and possibly even making boats, that these people are beginning to become much more specialized in exploiting marine resources, that they're realizing and making use of the richness of the coastal area. The coastal area perhaps opening up, coasts becoming ice-free. You get these very nutrient-rich coastal areas, particularly with the demise of the glaciers, the ice sheets. You get a lot of sediment coming down into the waters. There's some suggestion that these people are moving to focus on large mammals like seals and things. They're possibly treating seals almost like reindeer, a sort of animal that is at home on land and in the water. And they're beginning to adapt their lifestyle. And of course, once they start to use boats, then mobility changes a lot. And we begin to see more things like harpoons, a more perhaps specialist technology developing. There's some suggestion that this might start as a kind of summer camps for the Ahrensbergian folk, and that they move away in the winter. But it does seem to become a very specific group of its own, where people are perhaps not even needing to move back inland, but living along the coast, really making the use of the emerging coastlines. So that's all very well. That's what's going on in Europe. What have we got in the UK? Well, in the UK, for a long time, we've known that we do have late Upper Paleolithic groups, particularly down in England. For a long time, they were called the Creswellian. They were thought to be related to the Hamburgian groups, particularly sort of later ones. Federmesser is one of the technical terms. But it's very difficult because this terminology, because we call them something different, we tend to see them as something different. And of course, that's much easier before you know that Doggerland exists. But once you know that Doggerland exists and people are probably ranging to and fro, then you can see that maps like the one on screen, it's showing us the sites that are found. But of course, those sites, it's much more difficult to us to pick up the sites underwater. And so getting these relationships that run between the locations where we've found on sites on land is really important. But the Creswellian is the kind of name to look out for. This is the well-researched, well-established group of late Upper Paleolithic material in Britain. And you can see that it doesn't extend into Scotland. I think largely because people have always known, in inverted commas, that we didn't have sites in Scotland, so they weren't looking for them. It's very difficult to recognize something if you don't really believe in it. And here's just a picture of the site at Creswell Crags. It's a fantastic place to visit. If you haven't been there, just outside Sheffield, I can well recommend it. There's a little heritage centre, although I saw it was having difficulties with finances recently. But you've got these fantastic caves, a whole series of caves going back into a narrow rocky gorge. And in some of the caves, they are now recognizing cave art. I mean, one of the big problems with cave art in the UK is just the way in which our geology has made it very difficult for us to see it. But of course, it doesn't only occur on cave walls. It also occurs on mobile artifacts and things. And you can see a rather beautiful horse engraved on a bone from the caves down below as well. So really interesting place to visit if you're into the Paleolithic. So for a long time, nothing in Scotland. And as I say, very much this was what I was taught when I was a student. Conditions were just presumed to be too difficult. I don't really know why, because we've always known that there are human groups that can live in icy conditions, but for some reason we never thought that applied to the end of the last ice age. Also, I think we were perhaps looking for the wrong thing. We were looking for very primitive people. And obviously I've put up a rather kind of lampooning ancient glass slide this image is from, but you know, we were looking for very primitive people. We assumed they just wouldn't be able to survive in Scotland. And, you know, we'd vaguely poked around a few caves and not found anything. So I think we were perhaps looking in the wrong places and looking for the wrong thing. For a long, long time, it was assumed that if we were going to find Paleolithic in Scotland, we would find it in cave sites. And we didn't. So it obviously wasn't there. And it's worth just thinking about the way in which, in actual fact, our earliest Paleolithic indications in Scotland, they haven't been in cave sites. They've been in open air sites. There are cave sites that are interesting, and there are plenty of cave sites with artifacts, with middens relating to the Mesolithic. But so far, we still haven't got verifiable Paleolithic material from a cave site. Kilmelford Cave would be, sorry, the only one. There's one cave site which sadly no longer exists, and I can talk about that in just a minute. But one of the problems with many of our cave sites, in fact, is that right at the end of the last glacial, and as we move into the early Holocene, the landscape's very unstable, partly because the land is bouncing back from the weight of the ice. There's a certain amount of what we call isostatic recovery. And it's a period when you get quite a lot of rock falls, not big things, but just small, localized rock fall, the building up of screes and things. And in fact, in many caves, the floor, the original floor of the cave, is obscured by rockfall. And sometimes you can see that midden material and things lies beneath that rockfall or goes down underneath it. But we've never had the resources to remove it, obviously health and safety issues as well. But so it may be that there's Paleolithic material in caves, but we just haven't got down to it. But I do think it's very interesting that the principal sites that we've found are all open air, and perhaps we have just been looking in the wrong place. So here's a map with the Paleolithic sites that we've got today. This is as up to date, I think, was made by Kate Britton at the University of Aberdeen a couple of weeks ago. And you can see that we've got Paleolithic material now spread right across Scotland. It has to be said, in fact, I think all of these sites are accidental finds. They weren't found by people who were out looking for Paleolithic material. Some of the sites we've known about for a long time, but found it difficult to accept and recognize that they're Paleolithic. And only one of the sites, number 8, is a cave site. And that's the site at Kilmelford. And sadly, the cave no longer exists because the archaeology was discovered when the cave was being moved, blown up in order to make way for a hydroelectric, for an electric substation. And so the actual evidence from Kilmelford, we can't go back and revisit the record. There is a site at Inchnadanf, number 3, that also relates to caves. So far, we haven't got evidence of human settlement there. The reason that Inchnadanf is really interesting is because it's got a lot of evidence of reindeer. And if reindeer are around, we can be fairly certain that people will be around too. The thing about the reindeer at Inchnadanf, for a long time, people have studied them. People have looked to see if there was evidence of human activity, but all the human activity in the caves is more recent. And people have really just had to leave it. But now with isotopic analysis, with much more forensic analyses available, we can look at those reindeer and we can, for example, reconstruct their patterns of migration and things. And by doing that, that can help us to get an idea of the landscapes, much wider landscapes across Scotland, and areas that might be worth exploring for human settlement. So Inchnadanf remains a really important site. Most of the other sites are just sites where some of these tanged points, some of these, our old friends, these typical stone tools have been found, in fact, very often on more recent sites. And it's always been a slight sort of matter of opinion whether these tanged points relate to early post-glacial settlement, whether they could in fact be very early Mesolithic or whether they're late Upper Paleolithic. And I think now, I mean, some of them definitely have late Upper Paleolithic connections and things and relate to settlement in this early period. But I think we also have to start re-examining the change to the Mesolithic and looking at, are we just talking about life gradually changing, societies developing? Is it more of a grey scale of change, or is it new populations coming in? So really, there's a huge amount of work to be done as we look at these sites. And you've got one or two others. There's a site on Isla, number 9, where Stephen Mython was excavating. A new site came up, and when he and his colleagues went to dig it, they discovered that in fact the stone tools are a classic late Upper Paleolithic site. Similarly, site number 11 at Holborn, late Upper Paleolithic site of its own accord, like number 9. And then you've got sites like number 10, Lunan Head. Now that is a site that's very personal to me, because I was asked to look at the stone tools from Lunan Head in the 90s. And really, they looked to me like a late Upper Paleolithic site. They had all the classic signs of being late Upper Paleolithic. But at the time, nobody was accepting a late Upper Paleolithic for Scotland. And I knew that it would be very, very difficult to prove that the flints from Lunan Head were Paleolithic. Really, if you're going to go out on a limb and have the first of anything, you have to have an absolutely watertight argument. And I just couldn't construct that. So in the end, I kind of hunted around and found some early Neolithic sites where they'd used possibly similar sorts of stone tools in Ireland. And because we didn't have many early Neolithic sites, I was able to argue that this site was possibly one of the kind of slightly unknown types of early Neolithic industry. In fact, now Torben Ballens reassessed the flints from Lunan Head, and he's about to republish them as a late Upper Paleolithic site, as a good Paleolithic site in its own right. And this is something that I'm very, very pleased to see. It's really good, because it was always my kind of hunch, but I just didn't have the courage to go out on a limb, if you like. Other sites, 5, which is Mill Timber, number 6, Nethermills Farm. Sites where at Nethermills Farm, now we've got 2 or 3 nice late Upper Paleolithic pieces, which have come out of what you will know is a much larger Mesolithic flint assemblage. Mill Timber, quite a good, nice little late Upper Paleolithic assemblage. No sign of features surviving or anything, but clearly there are groups around in the area. In some places, like number 4, number 3, and so on, sorry, number 3 is Inchnadanf, number 4, sites like that, you've just got 1 or 2 of these classic tanged points. It's quite possible that if we were to go back to the whole assemblage, which often is much bigger, for example, at Shieldaig, maybe we would begin to find more types of late Upper Paleolithic tool. I think it's, again, very classic example of the way in which many of these sites, the tang points have been regarded as slightly idiosyncratic. And so people have devoted more effort into arguing why it's not Paleolithic than they have perhaps in looking at the possibility that it might be. So really, there's a lot of work to be done. But I think you can see that these sites do spread around Scotland. And here, just to give you pictures of some of the tools from these places. On the bottom left, you can see some of the beautiful Hamburgian points from Holborn, really classic, actually quite big pieces, very, very nice pieces. You can see the size of them in the caption, in fact, 42 millimeters, 32 millimeters, really quite big Scottish pieces there. In the middle, you've got some of the pieces from Nethermills Farm, the top pieces, and at the bottom, another piece from Holborn. and more pieces from Nethermills Farm to the right, including the base of a very nice little tanged point, again with the lengths all in the captions. So these are some of the sorts of classic stone tools that we're looking for. And here some photographs of them, pieces from Nethermills Farm, nice tang point from Shield Egg there, and some of the pieces, one of the pieces from Isla, from Rutherport and Silach. So these are the sorts of things that we're looking at. But one of the problems for me is just this problem of having a Paleolithic which only occurs where we find stone tools almost by chance. And we really can't have a Paleolithic that we only find by accident. Yes, it's very difficult to find. Yes, we're just talking about a few pieces, but I think we do have to think of a more concerted way of finding the sites. I mean, nice pieces do come up. Here's one of the pieces found by field walking at Nethermills Farm in Aberdeenshire. So this is classic Mesolithic D-side contribution to our studies of the Paleolithic. This is, you know, as cutting edge as it gets in archaeology. And Mesolithic D-side is going out and looking at the lithic scatters, which are some of our main indications that archaeology is there. So it's a really important thing to do. But we have to also work out how to take it on beyond the stone tools. And obviously, when you're dealing with a Mesolithic site, that's not difficult because you can think about, should you be thinking of excavation? Should you be doing some test pitting and things? But when you just have one or two tanged points or shouldered points, when you just have one or two Paleolithic pieces, of course, it's far less likely that you're going to find a site surviving. Those pieces have been lying in the ground for so much longer, they've quite possibly moved around from the site where they were originally found, or the site's been where they were originally dropped, or the site's been long destroyed. We have to really find out about the conditions of the site. What would that area have been like 15,000 years ago? We have to start thinking in a very different way. One of the interesting things is about this slightly later period of the Hamburgian, the Havelti, is that if you look at this map, you can see that these Havelti sites, where they're mapped in Europe, they occur slightly more to the west. And I think it's quite interesting that many of the pieces that are coming up in Scotland, the European specialists would see them as being more akin to this Havelti group than perhaps your very classic Hamburgian. So, you know, maybe we're starting to see things shifting across Doggerland and over to the west. And one of the things I think, you know, again, if we think about it's interesting that we're not finding a huge amount of late Paleolithic evidence. When we get it, the sites are very different to your kind of Mesolithic flint scatter, where you might get thousands of pieces. Late Upper Paleolithic, much less. Now, of course, any archaeological site has a lot of pieces that are general and probably could come from any period. Flint working results in a lot of indistinguishable, just general debris. But another thing we have to think about is, what exactly is life like at this time? And these are groups who are really moving into new territories as the glaciers are receding. They're explorers, they're pioneers, moving in to see what a landscape's like, to investigate it. And that's a very different sort of activity to the activity that you undertake when you're thinking of actually occupying somewhere, when you're thinking of settling down and putting roots. An exploratory activity, you tend to carry everything with you. You're not sure what you're going to find. So you need to make sure that you've got all that you need with you. You tend to travel quite light and with just a few people. You might be sometimes wanting to move quite fast. In other areas, you might want to hang around and have a look at an area in more detail, but you tend to leave much less behind you. You tread very lightly on the ground. If possible, you're not going to be dropping your stone tools. You're not going to be wasting them and leaving them behind because you're not too sure whether or not you're going to find flint sources in the area where you're going. So you do need to make sure that if you're moving ever onwards, that you've always got the needs, what you need to survive with you. So it's quite possible that these early sites, they really, really leave a much, much lighter footprint than the later sites where we're getting groups who are comfortably settled into an area. It's quite possible that our late Paleolithic sites are almost a sort of archaeology where you're not got archaeology. And in order to find them, perhaps one of the things we need to think about, like I was saying with looking at the patterns of migration for reindeer, perhaps we need a much more holistic, landscape-focused approach. We know that people are living in a very, very close relationship with the land. They're much more a part of the world around them. And so in order to find their sites, in order to see what they're doing, we have to really, really understand that world. We have to start to unpick the detail of what Scotland might have been like for those folks who came here right at the end of the last ice age in order to explore the country, in order to think about the possibilities of moving in more permanently. And so we can start now again with the sort of much more forensic archaeological approaches to look at all sorts of different aspects. We can look at the animals, we can look at migratory patterns of reindeer, we can look at other animal bones and see, are animals moving around? What sort of diets are they eating? How well fed are animals? Animal sizes, herd sizes, what sort of populations can the landscape maintain? We need to be looking at the plants. We need to be pushing back our pollen cores right back to the to pre-Holocene. We need to be moving into late glacial deposits, looking at the development of tundra, looking at the development of birch woodland in different areas across the country. How does the landscape change? Climate. We need to be looking at all the proxies that we have in microfossils, in loch cores and sediment cores and things. What was the temperature like? Rainfall, wind patterns. It's possible now to start to reconstruct all these things. And people have been doing it. But what archaeologists need to do is get these studies and try and put them together so we can build up a picture of the whole world. We need to be looking at what resources are there? What sort of stones might they be using? Where are they going to find stones? Do they have to bring everything with them? Is it possible that they can pick up material on the coast in Scotland? Or are they mainly using flints that come from Doggerland? Torben Ballen's been looking at the raw materials and seeing possibly some difference between the types of flint that the very earliest groups are using, which are probably brought in from further afield, and the types of flint as groups get to know an area better and they're making use of more local materials. We can look at the coast. When does the coast become ice-free? Where is the coast? When do icebergs go? Things like that. These are absolutely crucial studies if we're going to understand how human groups move around Scotland. What sort of resources are they using? Currents and tides. If you're out there in a small craft, how do you get moved around the coast? What areas are difficult? All of these sorts of things. There is work going on paleo currents and paleo tides. Often it's quite sort of broad scale work. We need perhaps to see if we can bring it down to actually look at where we're, again, crucial, tied in with as Doggerland disappears, as the coast changes, where are the sounds? Where are the islands? How easy is it to get out to the islands? Things like that. People are so closely interlinked with the world. And really, I think one of the mistakes that we've been making in the past is to look at the archaeological evidence as if it is a standalone evidence, but it isn't. People are part of the world, and we can only understand the late Upper Paleolithic of Scotland if we really, really get a holistic view of the world in which they live. And it is a dynamic world, it's a changing world. We know that the ice sheets are retreating. We know that the Younger Dryas changes things and suddenly brings back a return to cold conditions. We really need to get a very, very focused view of all that if we're going to understand this very early settlement of Scotland and where we might find the archaeological evidence. And so we need to build up ways of looking for archaeology where there's very, very little archaeology. We need to really work on these almost kind of ghosts in the landscape to try and just find these elusive traces of these very early sites, even if they're hardly leaving any trace behind. We know the archaeology is there. We've got enough sites, but we need to kind of stop the way in which at the moment sites just come up by chance. Hopefully in the next 5-10 years we'll actually be beginning to get Paleolithic sites that we're finding where we're actually looking for Paleolithic sites. That would be a really exciting development and a big step forward. And like I say, the landscape changes. You get these comings and goings with the Younger Dryas, but overall there is this general transition to more temperate conditions. Ice cover retreats, the coast becomes open, relative sea level drops, air temperature increases, vegetation develops, you get woodland moving across Scotland, and we move into what we call today the Holocene. And what we call and what we all know and love, we move into the Mesolithic. But as I've mentioned earlier, that transition brings a whole other suite of questions. What happens to the reindeer hunters when the reindeer disappear? Are they able just to adapt? Are they well enough used to the coast that they can shift to really to become the seal hunters? Are they able to move inland and exploit other types of deer, for example, red deer or other deer, other large mammals? There's a whole load of information that we just don't have the answers to, because in many ways, all my professional life, we've been looking at the Mesolithic, the fact that it came into a virgin landscape. We now know that that wasn't the case. We know there's a whole transition there that we need to look at. And as you know, archaeologists love to argue about transitions. So we may have sorted the Mesolithic, Neolithic transition, but now we've got a whole other earlier one for people to argue about. So that'll bring on some good conference presentations and things, I think. So really, this has just been a sort of romp through Paleolithic Scotland, very much just touching on things, partly because the evidence is still, we don't have an enormous amount of evidence if you compare to Neolithic Scotland, any other period in prehistory. There's huge amount of information we need to look at the very beginning of it. When do the people first come in? What goes on during the Paleolithic? And as I say, how do things then transfer? How do we move into the Mesolithic? It's a field that's really only just opening up. So if you're out there and you're a student, you've got it all ahead of you. It's a great time to get into it because there's a whole world of research just waiting to be done. And Scotland, you know, it's great because we've got modern techniques and we've researched. And if we put the two together, there's so much that we're going to be able to do over the next few decades. And we still need people to be going out and finding the sites. So we still need field walkers. So even if you're not going to be taking a university degree or getting a job as a postdoc on some big research project, if you've got weekends to go out there and do field walking, that's just as an important contribution. Thanks very much.